Hi everyone, this is Tommy from Studio Ultra Mega with another Operation Battle Ready tutorial, episode 28, Layered Highlighting using a Gradient. In this tutorial, we're going to go over dynamic highlighting again, but we're going to be paying special attention to what's going on the palette. Okay, you see here we have our colors laid out dark to light. I've got mine pretty close together here so it all fits in a nice camera shot, but you could stretch this out further over your palette. And what we're doing is we're just between two colors mixing them together and creating that gradient. You stir them into each other, try to make sure you got a good flow. What you just saw was me dip in and grab a little, I've got the cap there visible to show you a little bit of matte medium. Matte medium isn't totally necessary, but it does soften your paint and make it just a skosh more translucent, so that you can end up with a little softer blends with your brush work. And again, we just combine those colors together and try to get as smooth a transition between the two as possible. Now, while we're painting, we can go and dip into any point in that gradient and the color already exists. Making a gradient like this saves you a lot of time in your process, especially if you have to go back and forth between colors, because those previous colors already exist in this gradient without having to totally mix them fresh again every time. I've already got a layer of Abyssal blue over the pants and the little bolero style jacket we're working with here. So now we can just dip right into the gradient. I kept that cap full of matte medium there, so hopefully you can tell about how often I dip into it. And when I dip into it, I'm like touching the tip of my brush to it. I'm not really globbing it up in there. I prefer to hit it often and in tiny amounts. And off camera, every time you see me dip that brush, I'm also adding a little water. And you can see the real smooth transition that's already happening here. That is at least in part due to that matte medium softening that paint up for me. And let me just iterate again, when you see me dipping into that matte medium, it's really only the tip of my brush. It takes very little to get the job done. And it's always with about the same amount of water. So keep that in mind when you start using these additives. Coming up here, the color I'm working with is kind of getting pushed into the dark and gets a little dark, and you can see me grab a little bit of the lighter blue and drag it back in. That's another reason we like the gradients, just real time, real quick adjustments on the fly. Also, while I'm doing this, keep an eye on where I pull colors out of in the gradient and what I'm doing with the brush in the gradient. So now we're about to start the next layer of highlights, building up off of our first, and you'll see after a little dip in that matte medium, we move up the gradient to a shade I like better. Now that's not a particular shade. I'll go a little left or right of it depending on the area I'm working on the model to help with the blends. But overall, I moved about a quarter of an inch up that gradient and to the next visibly detectable lighter tone. As we get ready to start the next layer, you'll see I pull a little bit of that light blue back into the darker, that's Bering blue, because that jump was bigger than I wanted it to be. So right there on the spot, just in a couple seconds, I was able to adjust that tone real easily. Normally when I do these tutorials, I like to speed them up. I don't like to waste your guys' time. And I usually speed them up about 4 times. This time I only speeded it up double because so much is happening there on the palette I want you to see. So sorry for the longer gaps. I tried to make sure there was a peaceful music jam between my talkings. But yeah, I really wanted to see what's happening on that palette back there, and to get a much clearer shot of how some of these blends work. Also important to note when you're building these highlights that sometimes you can get a little bit brighter of a tone simply by going over it with the exact same color again. When you're working with slightly translucent layers, sometimes just doubling them up will actually make the color brighter before you move on to the next layer. Now I've been working this area of the gradient so long it's gotten a little thin on my palette, so I can just dip in and get a little bit of dark back in there, dip into that wet palette, dip into the bright, and recreate that whole same tone using the paint that's already there to kind of guide my blend. And now I'm right back into the action. And you can see, similar to the last tutorial, the highlights are still falling on the facets of the model that would be favored by a general overhead light source. Techniques and methods are the same. All we've changed is the color, and this time I'm showing you what's happening on the palette. As we move into this next layer, you'll see that in the gradient, I've kind of completely jumped over the basic Bering blue color. This is just an artistic choice. This isn't something you're going to do every time you work with a gradient. This had everything to do with the specific tones I'm using and the size and shape of the facets of the model. Had this model been a little bulkier with wider areas like a suit of power armor, there would have been more room for me to engage that straight Bering blue color. But because we got a lot of tight folds on a slim model, I can skip that basic tone, and since my paints are all being made translucent with that matte medium, I can skip a tone and move on up to that brighter tone and have it blend in just fine. Now, as I've been painting, I've noticed the inside of that pant leg was getting a little too dark, or like almost as dark as the shin, which is underneath the knee and bent back. So I'm taking the time to go and brighten that up a little bit so it matches the rest of the lighting. One of the reasons I love wet palettes and working off of gradients like this is it makes it less of a step-by-step process and more of an artistic process. As I'm working, you'll see I'll just see an area that I wasn't pleased with. Even in the middle of doing a particular layer of highlight, I'll stop and go into some darks. Like here, I'm going and I'm adjusting the other side of that arm. And then I'll go and I'll hop right back into the layer of highlights I was working on. And what you're seeing me do here on the palette is that area of paint is starting to get a lot of buildup now. I've been swirling around in it for quite some time, and I want this particular highlight to be specific. So I just pull that color that I've achieved that I want off to the side a little bit, create a little pocket right next to the gradient, and that little bit of paint will not get mixed up in the rest of the gradient. I think I've mentioned this before, but one thing I want to make clear here again, especially important in this gradient video, is I'm not really trying to teach a specific 1, 2, 3 process, and that's kind of why I like working with gradients. They kind of let me ignore 1, 2, 3 processes like that. I don't like when painting miniatures feels like an assembly line at all. I find I actually get more done and engage more at my painting table when it feels like art, when I feel like I'm making creative decisions and not following technical steps, right? And of course there's technical steps we all have to follow and deal with. But what I'm trying to do is kind of trying to open you up to feeling the artistic choices you get to make on your model, and that you're not just filling in their pants blue and putting the right color stripe on it, or edge highlighting it the way you saw in heavy metal. I want you to feel the model. I want you to feel the sculpt. I want you to create light sources, even if they're general overhead ones, so that these things can be felt as solid objects. I don't really even go for realism. Usually my work has more of an animated vibe to it, but I digress. Basically what I'm trying to say is by finding methods and processes that are assembly line, you might crank out a couple extra models a week. But when you lavish attention on a model and you get to make artistic choices instead of merely following technical steps, you might find yourself more engaged in actually enjoying this part of the hobby, as opposed to it being something you just get through. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it either entertaining or informative, or both. I would like to take a moment to thank our patrons over at Patreon who make these videos possible. Without you, we would not have the time or resources to devote to this. And if you would be so kind, please like and subscribe.